Kriegik Wind. That was what Bryda had called Osrith when she had finally left the fortress at Tidui. That, should she meet her on the battlefield, she would turn from her. No greater honor was there than for a Danish warrior to speak of that to another. Bryda had remembered. And Osrith had to remember that she had chosen to remain at Tidui. Yes, it was a vague agreement with Hywel in exchange for the use of ice spite. Yet, as the wagons were prepared in Hywel's courtyard, Osrith felt utterly alone. Yet, there was a familiar feeling about the fortress, a feeling of solidity, of belief stretching down into the earth firm and broad and mighty. Christianity had come to the British Isles when the Romans were still here and had begun to spread, at Caerleul, in Ireland, in Cornwall. Undisturbed by Saxons and Angles it flourished, until Rome saw fit to send Augustine, who converted the Saxons in Kent and Wessex, and the Angles in Lindsey and Diriyah. So the Cymric and the Say had a second strand to their enmity from 597, with more and more layers added over the decades. Pagans in Mercia would not convert and the Cymric tolerated them, not forcing the Irish Church on them, something which the Augustine Christians condemned the Cymric for. And that was before the Norse and Danes. To Osrith, politics and religion and geographical origin had intertwined, like a fallen wool loom, tangled, broken threads, knotted out of all recognition from the original pattern the loom master had intended for it. Their journey was going to take them north, into the lands of Anarord, king of Gwynedd who was, Hywel had explained to Osrith, going to meet them at an ancient holy site. "Do not fear, you are quite safe," he told Osrith. But Peilig did not sit outside her door at night, and once, when Osrith had wakened in the night, she could see the outline of a man hovering by the half-open door. "I would have felt safer aboard my ship," Osrith told him. "Could Angus not just have put in at Holywell and I could have met you there?" Hywel had laughed at this, and shown her to the feast that night, which he was giving before the majority of the court, including his 3 sons, were to travel to Treffinham. Hywel had found a place for her at his table, honored guest that she was. "I know it was you who set that Danish bitch free," Lydok whispered to Osrith, leaning over to her and pretending to fill up her water cup. "I will have you, pregnant with the king of Alba's child, or not," he salivated, his greasy grey hair dangling close to Osrith's face. "I will fill you up with my cock, and make you know what being humped by a Welshman is like." Lydok put a hand on her leg, and leaned over to her. "I too am very glad you are here, lady," he slimed, bunching up his hand but extending his middle finger, and rubbing it on her thigh, to imitate a peony. Osrith pushed his hand away, but he caught hers and drew it to his groin where a hard lump was forming. "Like what you feel?" Lydok asked, as he rubbed her hand hard across it. It pushed back insistently onto Osrith's hand. She turned to look at him. "Is there supposed to be something there?" she asked. Lydok threw her hand away, angrily. "I will hump you, lady," he promised her, growling at his face. "You will die trying," Osrith hissed back, angrily. "So much for safe." The seat next to her was taken and Osrith turned to look who had sat by her. "You are well, Osrith?" Peilig asked, at the opportune moment. With heavy gratitude, Osrith turned to him and nodded. Though a little tired, she told him. Beside Hywel, his 3 sons were engaging in an ever-escalating drinking competition. Rodri was winning, but Edwin was not far behind. Young Owain has passed out and was asleep across the boards. "Perhaps you could escort me to my room?" "Perhaps you could remain with me, in my room," Osrith clarified, when they reached it. Peilig gave her a long look. "Lady Osrith," he began, "it is not becoming of one in your position to ask a man, ask a priest to." Osrith sighed, choosing not to unpick whether he was serious or attempting a weak joke. "That will be because I have been propositioned twice this evening. It would never have happened if my noble lords has been with me," she added, feeling the irritation that her voice was conveying. "You promised no harm would come to me, and if Lord Lydok finds his way to my room again, harm is what I may come to. I would defend myself," Osrith continued, "but I am somewhat disadvantaged currently." She put her hand to her ever-blooming stomach, and would have sworn that it had swelled several inches in the fortnight she had been at Dehu Bath. "Understood, lady," Peleg said, his jovial demeanor changing suddenly. I am sorry, too, that your men are not with us. One in particular? Osrith thought, as she pulled furs over her, and Peleg buried himself in his cloak and hunched down by the door. The next morning, Hywel announced they were leaving the next day, and Lydok was to play king as the king said, and Osrith was relieved to hear that such an odious man was not coming with them to Treffinham. We are going by ship? Osrith asked. Peleg shook his head. Walking, although you may have a horse, he conceded, and the men did indeed walk, in robes of wool bleached in the sun, hair flowing down their backs, resembling what Osrith knew of the ancient Druid class, the intellectuals of pre-Christian society, that Paulinus had done his utmost to put to sword under a genocide over the whole of Wales. The Druid last stronghold had been Niceman, Anglesey, and the Paulinus sent his men, through the shallows, to exterminate the last of them. Would he have come this way? Osrith wondered. Would Romans have trod this coastal route around this huge, curved bay, eliminating all of the ancestors of Hywel? Many said the ancients went to another peninsula, across the sea from Cornwall, and thrived, sending back Uther and Arthur, to be at odds with Vortigern, who had invited the Sayers mercenaries to help him. A week. The weather mild for November, for the winter comes later in this part of the world, and the landscape slowly changed, from tidal flats to wooded forests which gave way to mountains banked up on the northern horizon. Food was fish from the rivers they passed, with lore and a stew of a green-white vegetable Osrith had never tasted before, whose flavor was pungent and tangy, accompanied with soft round tubers that Hywel told her proudly only grew in the far west of Dyfed. All of these were supplemented with a hard, bread-like substance which took a deal of chewing but seemed to last the journey and kept well without weevils. Hywel's 3 sons entertained them each evening with a retinue of songs and poems, taking the time trying to outcompete one another with the most melodious lay or the longest story. Branwen was favourite again, as were the bastards Say, and one night a familiar story of a different kind came to Osrith's ears, of a man called Cuneda who had come from Pitland and established the northern kingdom of Gwynedd. No, Osrith thought, for she recognized the theme from Mengus and Felilim's boastful challenges on the ship as they sailed this coast, but in reverse. But a new name came to her ears, a connection that she had never made, Edwin son of El, of Dyria, who has, according to his namesake, taken Niceman and had named it after his homeland, the homeland of the Angel. They camped under stitched sheepskin, and Osrith insisted Peleg be next to her. He did not object, but lay well away from her. And Osrith slept well, and dreamed of people living here, tiny folk from centuries before, in balmy climes, protected by cold, high mountains, which she imagined to be caused invoked by the singing and storytelling. At an estuary to the west, where they camped and rested, Peleg told Osrith that they were now at the border of Gwynedd, Anarod's kingdom, and Osrith looked across the water, tracking another peninsula, where, she reckoned, Bardsea Island was. Anarod, who she had seen departing his ship there with others, while Angus looked on. As they moved on that morning, guards came out to meet Hywel, dismounting from horses not much bigger than the ponies of Guthred's Cumbraland, and stood before Hywel. They talked to the king for some time, before remounting and walking their mounts sedately beside Hywel. An escort, through the mountains, Peleg told Osrith, who was the only other person on a horse. To protect us from the mountain spirits and the dwarves and the dragons. In other words, the Scythe, Osrith thought, as their way rose up and ever upwards, for she had been able to feel them, and the Morrigan, as soon as they had passed into Anarod's kingdom. What was it tagged? Poor, beloved tagged would say. A king marries the Morrigan, for the is the land and the sea and the sky. And she appears to people chosen for battle, to warn them of impending upheaval and to be ready. But, what upheaval could there be here? Unless Hywel was going to attempt his takeover now, in which case he was without horses, men and supplies and was walking through Anarod's land. They passed a lakeway down in the valley of a mountain nest, of a blue she had never seen, and mist seemed to curl about the mountains here as they rode upwards. It was colder now, and Osrith huddled in her cloak, and moved closer to Peleg that night for warmth, although he lay as still as rock as she nestled beside him. In the morning, a lammergeier, A huge vulture bird swooped over them, which startled Osrith, who cried out as the bird skimmed close to her head, and she stared, open-mouthed, as the bird, bigger than an eagle, lifted an elderly ewe from a field and carried it off in its huge talons. "Sing, Osrith," asked the king that night. Stars were overhead. The weather was fine. And Osrith shook her head. "Do you wish your animals to flee into the wilderness and the heavens to crack open with lightning?" Her rebuff was met with men's pooh-poohing of Osrith's denial that she would make a good Sinchai, and she might have been reasonable. But singing always made her sad, for she recalled Tagged, and his baritone voice tripping around them so often as they rode or walked anywhere with Domhnall and Constantine. Owain stepped in and sang a song of the Fae, the little people, a dragon, a hoard of gold and a magic ring. "We must put this by the fire," Peleg implored, when Osrith began to assemble under the sheepskin tent. "You cannot be that close to me, girl, even if you are great with child. You cannot," he added, a strangulation in his voice. But it was strange to Osrith that a man with children and who had urges with men would find her, all fat with a baby growing inside her, body plump and unappealing, no longer lithe and slim. Osrith could no longer bind her breasts. Where was the appeal? So she apologized for the liberty she had taken and spent the night almost sitting on the fire wrapped up between it and a tussock of grass, with Peleg denying she had to apologize while he settled to her left and the king to her right. In the morning, Osrith found Owain, Hywel's youngest son, shaking her shoulder, and looked at the world, a world with mountains behind them and wide green upland around them, falling gently to a coast about half a day's ride away. "We are going to be at Holy Well this morning," he told Osrith, handing her some of the everlasting bread. "Hywel, my father, has gone on with some of his men, and the other kings. Come on," he encouraged. "Other kings?" Osrith asked, muzzily. "Oh yes." Owain enthused, happily. "Did you not know? Fanfail and Brokefail at Muirig of Gwent have been with us since Abergwaun." Osrith did not know. Petty kings in tiny kingdoms. Yet, she knew of Gwent, for it bordered Mercia, Gloucester in particular, and she recalled Peleg saying many expatriates who frequented his alehouse had come from there. It made sense. It was just over the border. Whereas, Hywel's incursion into Gwynedd took him deeply into the land of his fellow king. "We are invited," Owain told her, brightly. "And our order extends an open, indefinite invitation to any pilgrim to Holy Well. We are fortunate we can get to it before the winter storms and snows." There was a pool, clear with cold spring water, flowing down a gentle incline which gathered in a rock depression in low-lying ground. A square of sandstone had been used to support the earth and the Welsh gathered around it, standing evenly at its perimeter. It had taken about an hour for the party to reach it, in bright, easy morning sunlight. Peleg drew Osrith's horse to a standstill and stood by her watching the men, as they held one in Othar's hands. Around them, stakes of wood had been driven into the ground and on the trees linen strips had been tied. "People leave votive offerings, and prayers," Peleg told her, watching her look. "Oh, they are of the pre-Christian beliefs," he conceded, when she turned back to look at him. "But these are prayers to God," he added, raising a hand heavenwards, "and God receives all prayers, regardless of the manner in which they are presented to him." Her eyes were drawn to the men, who were singing now, hair soft gold down their backs in most cases, some of them age-whitened. Edwin and Rodri, Hywel's two eldest sons, had hair of chestnut brown which flowers past their shoulder like the rivulets of the holy water filling the well about which they stood, while Owain's matched his father's. Time passed, as Osrith watched the men, lulled by their chanting and humming, and she barely realized she had taken Peleg's hand when he offered it to her, helping her down onto the soft earth, leading her to the pool. "Fyrchi Gwaidhelth," Hywel said, and Peleg replaced his hand with the king's, so she stood in a circle, too. "Planty Osrith," he added, and moved a hand over her stomach. Had she realized it, Osrith might well have protested at the right, but, looking back, she could not describe the feeling of it, except as completeness, as unifying. She was one with the land, her and Finan's child, and of the sky and of the water. And she placed her hands within the pool as Hywel invited her to, immersing her arms to her elbows. And then she saw him. Not immediately, and more like a slow realization that he stood before her. Dyfnwal. Dyfnwal, yet younger, shorter of hair and hazel of eye. Yet pale golden blonde hair tumbled to his waist, and he had a merry good nature in his face. "A king wishes to talk to you," Phyleag told Osrith, and the men around the well drew together when she stepped away, like water flow converging when a rock has been passed. The morning's sunlight appeared to shine more brilliantly now, and the grass slush, like in high summer. Beyond them, a grey-green sea blended with hazy grey-blue sky. And a king stood, with the imperfect clone of Dyfnwal beside him. "You are Osrith?" the king asked, and as he did so, recognition lodged in Osrith's mind. He had got out of the boat with his retinue at Bardsea Island, with this boy, too. "I am, King Anarord," she guessed. The boy looked up to the man, who nodded acknowledgement. And she realized something else, too. For all that Hywel said about her being kin to him in Deheubarth, this man was more her kin, descended far more directly from Urien. "Let us walk the coast path," Anarord suggested, and Osrith accompanied them, leaving Phyleag standing and watching. "You are in my kingdom at last," Anarord said to her, "for I have been wondering about Gwythelth's child for so many years. She died, did she not, birthing another Saxon child?" "Yes," Osrith agreed. "My brother, Wigger, lives." "Wigger," Anarord muses, "I have heard the name. He rules Edwin's land?" Osrith paused for a moment and thought. "You mean Edwin, from many years in the past?" Osrith asked. "Son of El?" "Just so," Anarord replied, and Osrith realized how easy he was for her to understand. Not for the king of Gwynedd the South Wallin tongue. Indeed, he spoke the words as if he had just met her beside the Forth, and she had come straight out of Dunnottar and turned to British settlement within its outskirts. "Time moves slower in my lands, we have few enemies to disturb us. Except for the Norse, who Flansinna has caused to be so desperate they must trade my fishing villages for as many piscod as they can lay their hands on. But I am lucky, Hywel has settlement issues to deal with." "He is certainly unfortunate," Osrith conceded, as they drew up to slightly higher ground. Below them, the Welsh were still around the pool, now on their knees, praying. Phyleag, she noticed, was over by her horse, patting its neck in a slightly distracted way. "And when he is unfortunate, he has less time to invade my lands and overthrow me," Anarord confided, leaning over to Osrith as if sharing a secret. The boy heard the king's words, but said nothing. "Especially when I brine them too. I am dying, Osrith," Anarord continued, noting the horrified look on her face. "My son, Idwell, who is praying for forgiveness and cleansing of the sin of killing, on behalf of all the men of Gwynedd, who you may see beside Rhodri," and Osrith glanced to see a golden-haired man on Hywel's left, would. He broke off, and the boy who looked like Dyfnwal glanced up to King Anarord. "I sent some men to Woden'sfield, because whether Ethliad was my enemy, or the Wessexes, or the men of Deheubarth and Gwent, or whether they were not, the common enemy are the Norse." He drew close to Osrith. "Do you believe I would have anything to do with the bastard Mersons or the bastard Northumbrians?" Or any said, "Not after Augustin would not show his humility to our bishops. Not after Edwin took on Augustin's teachings, not our own. After we shielded him and sheltered him from King Ethelfrith." Osrith nodded. What else could she do? Here was a man with little time left, who wished to speak to her, the past dripping from him like sweat on a boiling hot day. It was beyond her to get to the bottom of all of his nuances. Anarord sensed Osrith was being patient with him and leaned across to Osrith again, his pale hair shielding one side of his face. "Osrith," he said, softer now, "Idwell, my son, would yield to Hywel, to unite the northern and southern Wallese. And it makes good, rational sense, but that is because he thinks he has no other option. He knows I have one more card I could play." "Why do you think he separated you from your men?" he ventured. "Because I agreed, in the use of a magic BL," she stopped because Anarord shook her shoulder. Whatever you think the reason is, think again. Anarod's face was lit up with eagerness, excitement, to convert something of vital importance. You came here with 3 warriors, did you not? Osrith nodded. And how do I know this? Letter? Treaty? Anarod laughed again. Because I arranged, or tried to arrange, for you to meet me at Nisenlai. He told her, to meet my beloved grandson. Anarod put a hand on the shoulders of the boy with him, and thrust him a few paces forward. Owain, he told her. Owain map Diffenwald.